Hello and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be ranking all the continents on a tier list, not based on how good I think the continents are, but how well I think they fit the definition of continent, to determine once and for all how we should divide the world up into continents. We're going to be using two metrics to determine this. Obviously, we're going to be using the geography of the continent. So, like, how similar is it to just being a single landmass? But obviously, basically every single continent that you could imagine has islands associated with it that most people would agree are part of the continent. So there's always going to be some ambiguity. The second criterion that we're going to be using is culture, because a lot of people like to divide continents based on culture, for example, Europe and Asia. So I think it's an important factor to consider. We're going to be ranking those separately and then taking the average. If it would be straddling two tiers, then I'm going to use my own judgment to determine which one I think is more important. So we'll start with Africa. In terms of geography, Africa is extremely well defined. It has a very small coastline. I don't think there's anything that's badly defined about Africa. The only problem is that sans the Suez Canal, it would be connected to Eurasia. Even with the Suez Canal, a lot of people would consider the Sinai to be part of Africa because Egypt controls it. So minus that, though, there's not really anything else. So I would say geographically it's A tier. Culturally, it is pretty diverse, though. So there's a lot of different, obviously, cultures that inhabit Africa. But obviously, the most important divide is between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's just a massive cultural difference between the two places. So I'm gonna give it a C, which means for culture, which means overall it will be a B. Next up, Europe. They're gonna get D tier for geography, not only because of the Asia problem, although I do think that the fact that it's connected to Asia and not really divided from Asia alone would put it in C tier for geography, but also the fact that there's not really a clear dividing line. Like, some people would say that part of Kazakhstan should be in Europe because of the Urals being the dividing line, but I don't think anyone actually considers the part of Kazakhstan to be in Europe, which just makes everything more confusing. Also, the Caucasus, I don't think really most people would consider them to be part of Europe, even though they would be under a lot of definitions of Europe. And also, Turkey owns a bit of Europe. So there's just a little bit of confusion about like what actually defines Europe. So I think D tier is good for geography. As for culture, I think that they are culturally similar enough to be in A tier. They do have some differences between Western and Eastern Europe, and notably, there's the existence of Turkey on the continent, and Albania, which are both Muslim, whereas the rest of Europe is mostly Christian. There's also the problem that European culture which is just Western culture, isn't by no means confined to Europe, at least anymore, mostly because of colonization. So, because of that, I don't think it's justifiable to put Europe in S tier for culture. So, I think A tier for culture makes sense for Europe. So, if they're in A tier and D tier, then I can choose to put them in B or C tier. And I think that the geography problem matters a lot more than the fact that they're mostly culturally united. So, C tier it is. Asia suffers from the same problems as Europe for geography, plus an Oceanian problem where it's not really clear where the border is between them and Oceania. Plus, they're the part of Eurasia that borders Africa. I don't think it's that controversial to say Asia should definitely be in the F tier for geography. In terms of culture, Asia also probably belongs in the F tier. It has so many diverse cultures that it's literally impossible to talk about all of them. It's by far the most diverse continent. It has, I think, a majority of the world's population, although I don't know how true that will be for long. It has everything from East Asia to South Asia to the Middle East to Central Asia to Siberia to Southeast Asia to Indonesia. And again, the Indonesia part depends on what you consider to be part of Asia, but just in general, Asia has so many different cultures. I think it also should be considered F tier for cultural unity, because that's what I'm ranking, just in case you were confused. Cultural, when I'm saying culture, I'm talking about how similar are all the cultures of the continent, and in Asia, they are not. So I don't think Asia should be considered a continent. I think it's kind of strange to do so. I think the only reason they are is because Europeans want to consider themselves to be a continent, which is like an archaic thing. That's the only reason Asia is considered a continent. Next up, Australia. In terms of geography, I'm going to put them in C tier. While the landmass of Australia is well defined, you can even just see from this image that it includes Tasmania, and the more you think about it, the more it's confusing as to which parts of Oceania are actually considered part of Australia. Like, is Australia just the island of Australia? Or does it include Tasmania? Does it include New Guinea? Or just Papua New Guinea? Why not the rest of Asia? That's a problem that Oceania also suffers with. But the fact that it's ambiguous whether the Oceanian islands are included in Australia makes it worse than Oceania in terms of geography. In terms of culture, Australia is just one country, so you would think its culture would be good, but obviously there are still cultural differences within Australia. However, I actually think the problem is the reverse. Australia, with the exception of like Aboriginal people, is so culturally similar to each other, you wouldn't expect it to be a continent. It would be like calling France its own continent because it has probably this less cultural diversity within it than France. And I feel like it's not the level of cultural diversity you would expect to see in a continent. I'm going to put it in C tier for culture as well, due to that, which means Australia is going to stay in C tier. As for whether or not it's better than Europe as a continent, I'm going to say it's not. That's just based on my personal judgment, because I think there's a better alternative. Okay, North America. Geographically, I'm going to put it in B tier. I think that it makes sense to divide America into North and South because tectonically they're different, biogeographically they're different. There's the Darien Gap separating them, and there's the Panama Canal separating them. But that obviously shows the problem of what do we actually define as the separator between North America and South America. And obviously you could have them be connected. So I think overall America's B tier for geography. I'm going to put it D tier for culture, which means overall it's going to be C tier yet again. I'm starting to stack up C tier here, I see. I'm going to put it over here in C tier. In case you were wondering, on the left means better, on the right means worse. So the reason I'm putting it in C tier for culture is because it's divided obviously between US and Canada, which have pretty similar cultures to each other. Mexico has, and a lot of the Central America and the Caribbean has similar culture as part of Latin America. And you would expect that to kind of be two separate continents. We're going to get to those two concepts as continents later on in the episode. But I think just in general, North America being divided from South America doesn't make it that much sense culturally. Next up, South America. It's going to be in B tier for geography as well. It's exactly the same geographic problems as North America. The only thing it doesn't have is the Greenland problem, but I don't think... I didn't even mention Greenland when I was doing North America because I don't think it matters that much, but it is kind of confusing that Greenland's part of North America and then what happened to Iceland, but I don't think it matters that much. So overall, South America, B tier for geography. In terms of culture, I'm going to put it in A tier because most South American countries have a pretty similar Latin American culture. The Guyanas might have a slightly different culture. I'm not very familiar with them, but overall, mostly similar cultures, about the amount you would expect for a continent. The only reason I'm not putting in an S tier is because Latin American culture definitely spreads beyond South America. So if you were trying to make a continent based on that, you would want it to include Latin America. Between B and A tier, I'm going to choose to put it in B tier, but above Africa in terms of whether or not it should be considered a continent, just because I think there are better alternatives. Antarctica, I'm going to put in A tier for geography. It's very well geographically defined, probably the best geographically defined out of all the continents. The only reason I'm not putting in an S tier for geography is because technically there is an archipelago under the ice sheets, and that leads to confusion. I don't think anybody actually is upset about it, but I feel like I should put it in A tier, not S tier. But it's fine because I'm going to put it in S tier for culture because everyone there is a scientist. Everyone there has the same culture. There's not even that many people there to begin with. So I think it makes sense to put Antarctica in S for culture, since I don't think there's that much culture to consider. And between A and S tier, I'm going to keep it in S tier because I've already said that the reason I didn't put it in S tier is kind of silly for geography anyway, but I think it is worth pointing out the flaw that exists so that commenters on this video don't point out the flaw and say that that should have put Antarctica below where it is. Some people don't consider Antarctica to be a continent, but then also just don't consider the land that Antarctica takes up to be part of any continent. which I think is absolutely ridiculous and a joke. So I'm not even going to consider that as an argument for Antarctica not being a continent. I really don't think there is any argument for Antarctica not being a continent, hence why I put it in S tier. The only argument is the archipelago thing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some other hypothetical ideas for continents in ways to organize the world, starting with Oceania, which is Australia, but you're making it very clear that you are including all the other islands. Geographically, I'm going to put this in A tier. The only problem is New Guinea being divided in half. I think everyone agrees that it's Papua New Guinea is part of Oceania and Western New Guinea, which is part of Indonesia, is not. I just think that's a really weird dividing line to choose. Like, at least it's clear, which is why I don't think it drags it down to B tier, but it is just sort of a weird dividing line to choose. The only unclear thing is whether East Timor should be part of Australia, but I don't think anyone who's watching this video even knows what that is. Look it up if you want. But yeah, I generally think that's the only part of Oceania that actually is unclear as to whether it should be part of it. The other reason that it's not an S tier is just because most people consider continent to be a landmass. I don't understand that. I feel like continents are just ways of dividing up the world. I feel like the fact that everyone considers Europe and Asia to be separate, even though they shouldn't be, kind of disproves the idea that a continent has anything to do with a landmass. So I'll put in A tier for geography. I'm also going to put in an A tier in terms of culture. Like, obviously, there's the difference between, like, Polynesian people and settlers, at least in Australia and New Zealand. But I think there's the amount of cultural difference you would expect for a continent, which leaves Oceania firmly in A tier. Next up is Eurasia. In terms of geography, I'm going to put it in A tier. I think the only problem with Eurasia is, first of all, Africa being excluded. Like, it kind of makes sense. I think that there is like a super narrow isthmus between the Sinai and the Africa that actually makes it make sense to exclude Africa in a lot of circumstances, and the fact that the Suez exists makes it make even more sense. But I still think that takes it down, and obviously the New Guinea problem also is there. So overall, I think it's A tier. In terms of culture, I'm going to put it in D tier. The only reason it's not F tier is because I don't think this continent has any cultural reasoning for it existing. Like, I don't think anyone who's saying Eurasia should be considered a continent thinks that culture should be considered as part of continents. And because of that, I feel like it kind of gets away with the fact that it's not culturally unified, if that makes sense. Like, maybe that's a terrible argument, but I feel like it should get away with that. So it's between B and C tier, and I'm going to put it in B tier because I think it has to be considered to be better than Europe as a continent. It just has to be. For my personal judgment, I think it's better than South America and Africa as well. Next up, we've got the Americas. In terms of geography, S tier. I feel like they're extremely well defined. There's not really anything you could argue that is wrong with them in terms of geography. You could argue, well, shouldn't they be split into North and South? But I genuinely think, like, it's fine to split them into North and South. It does create problems. There's nothing wrong with keeping them together. Like, they operate basically as one unit anyway. So, in terms of culture, I'm going to put them in A tier because there's Latin American culture, and then there's US and Canada, which have slightly different culture, and then there's also the Guyanas, which I, again, believe have different culture. And obviously, Latin American culture is not a monolith anyway. So, I think it's fair to put it in A tier. I'm going to also leave it in A tier because I think that its geography is less sound than its culture in terms of where I put it. I'm not going to put it above Oceania, though, because the New Guinea thing is much more egregious than the culture thing or the Panama Canal thing for the Americas. Okay, next up, we've got Afro-Eurasia. I'm going to put this in S tier for geography. It does have the New Guinea problem, but I don't think the New Guinea problem on its own is enough to bring it down. And it does kind of have the Greenland problem, but I think most people would agree if they're talking about Afro-Eurasia that Greenland is part of the Americas. So I don't think that's that big of a problem. In terms of culture, I'm going to put it in D tier for the exact same reason I put Eurasia in D tier, which is that it's not based on any sort of cultural argument. So it's weird to take it down to F tier for that. That puts it squarely in B tier. I personally believe it's a better continent than Eurasia, so I'm going to put it there. Next up, we've got Afro-Euraustralasia, which is basically just everything besides the Americas. I'm going to actually put it in B tier for geography, which I think is, you might think is kind of silly, but I think it's kind of silly to include this much. Later on, we're going to be talking about the whole world as if it's a single continent. This is basically the same thing as that, just excluding the Americas and I guess Antarctica. So I think it's kind of weird to do so, to like include this all as one continent. I feel like at that point you're just trying to say, hey, look, continents have no meaning. I feel like at the point where you're saying Afro or Australasia, you're just doing it to make a point that continents are kind of meaningless, which I agree they are. That's why we're able to make this tier list. But I think that Afro or Australasia is not very good. Culturally, I'm going to put it in D tier because, again, there's no cultural motivation for it. So that puts it in C tier overall. And I think it makes more sense than Australia, but less sense than North America. So it's going to go there. Now we're going to go from geographically defined continents that don't really do well culturally to the opposite, culturally defined continents that don't really do well geographically. First up, the Middle East. Now, this is just an image I found of the Middle East. We're going to get to the Middle East, including North Africa separately. This one happens to include Egypt. I'm not sure whether Egypt should be included. So just assume you can decide whether Egypt is included based on whether you count it as part of the Middle East. Culturally, I'm going to put it in B tier. I think the fact that this is culturally defined means I should judge it more harshly based on culture, and I don't think Middle Eastern culture is confined to the Middle East. Like, it's usually defined based on Islam being the main religion, but like Pakistan and Indonesia are the two most populous Islamic countries. Egypt is the third, and Egypt might or might not be included. At least I believe Egypt is the third. It might be Bangladesh, actually, come to think of it. And while Arab culture is similar, Turkey shouldn't be included in that, and neither should Iran. And both of those countries are almost universally considered to be part of the Middle East. So I think it's kind of weird. And I would put it in A tier if it weren't specifically designated to be its own continent because of culture. But I think I should judge it more harshly because of that. In terms of geography, easy F tier. Like, what are we even doing? That puts it between C and D tier, and I'm going to put it in D tier. I think that the fact that it doesn't work well with culture and the fact that its geography has, like, I mean, I guess I'll talk more about its geography just in case you were confused. There's not really any clear geographical borders for it, which is already a bad thing. Like, the Egypt thing is egregious. If you just want to consider it to be the Asian part of the Middle East, by the way, this image includes Thrace, which is part of Europe. That's this little thing. But the Middle East has no well-defined geographical borders, and even if it did, it's geographically connected to Asia, and so it has the same problems as Eurasia, just to be clear. I think its geographical flaws and the fact that it's supposed to be defined in terms of culture but doesn't do well in terms of culture definitely warrants it being D tier. Middle East, including North Africa. I'm going to speed run past this. A tier in terms of culture, at least you have all of the Arabs in one continent, and it seems that this image excludes Turkey, so that's also nice. But not everyone who does this actually excludes Turkey. I'm going to put it in F tier for geographical sense. It makes even less geographical sense than the other one, which would put it in C tier. I'm going to put it at the bottom of C tier because I don't think it makes much sense. It only makes marginally more sense than just the Middle East alone. The partner of Middle East and North Africa is Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a cultural thing based on the fact that people in Sub-Saharan Africa are different culturally to people in North Africa. I'm going to give it D tier for culture, though. Obviously, Sub-Saharan Africa is extremely culturally diverse. I think if you exclude Papua New Guinea, a majority of the world's languages come from here. There's two major religions as well as a bunch of minor religions. Most countries have multiple languages, forgetting about the continent as a whole. You could also easily divide it into sections like Southern Africa, East Africa, West Africa. So I think it's absolutely stupid to consider it to be good culturally. The only thing it has going for it is that they all share a similar colonial history, which is why it's not F tier. Although one could argue it's F tier. I'm also going to put it in D tier for geography just because the Sahara acts as a decent border, but otherwise there's no justification for it existing, which puts it squarely in D tier, and I think it's worse than the Middle East in terms of a continent because it's culturally defined but is not well defined in terms of culture. Next up, Central America. This is, I guess, not culturally defined. It is more geographically defined, but I'm putting it here because we're about to do some other American-related things. Culturally, Central America is going to go in B tier. I think Central American countries do have a more similar culture to each other than to the rest of Latin America, but I don't think it's that big of a difference. and it's not the amount of different variation you would expect for a continent. It's the same problem Australia had, honestly. So B tier for culture, and although it's geographically defined, I'm gonna put it in F tier for geography, partially because it is geographically defined. Like I think it only exists in terms of geography and because of geography. So I think that makes me a little harsher on it for its geography, but like it has absolutely no reason to be defined as separate. Like it is part of North America in terms of plate tectonics, which we'll get to, as well as there's no real dividing line. It's just the dividing line between Mexico and Guatemala. This image seems to have Belize as part of it, but generally Belize is sometimes considered part of it, sometimes not. So it's between C and D tier. I'm going to put it in D tier because I think that the geographical flaws of this, especially since it's defined in terms of geography, outweigh the cultural benefits. I do think it's better than Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East as continents, though, because I do think it is well defined. Anyways, on to the U.S. and Canada, which I've already talked a decent deal about. Obviously culturally defined. A tier in terms of culture. The only downside is they might be too culturally similar, but I mean there are cultural differences, but it's probably about the same amount as Australia. But I feel like the U.S. is more populated than Australia, so it does have more different regions than Australia, as well as Canada obviously being separate. So there's actually two different countries as opposed to one. And Quebec obviously is extremely different culture from the rest of Canada. Usually this would include like Puerto Rico and Hawaii, which also have different cultures. So I don't think it's as culturally varied as you would expect a continent to be, hence why it's not in S tier. I think it's a little too culturally similar to itself, but I think it's slightly better than Australia in being culturally varied, so A tier. In terms of geography, F tier, it has no reason to be geographically defined like that. Like at least the Rio Grande makes some sense, so maybe you could put it in D tier, but no. That puts it once again in C tier. I'm gonna say it's a worse continent than North America as a whole, but better than your Australasia because that's just a really stupid idea for a continent. So obviously the counterpart to this is Latin America. In terms of culture, S tier, it is the exact amount of cultural variation. Like obviously it has that, but it's the exact amount that I would expect a continent to have. You can't expect a continent to be culturally all exactly the same. I think, but you also can't expect it to be like Asia, which is like way too much cultural variation. I think this is the right amount, at least for what I would consider to be a continent. In terms of geography, once again, F tier. There is no geographical basis for it existing. It has the Rio Grande again because it's the counterpart of this of the U.S. and Canada. Overall, I'm going to put it in B tier. I think it's about the same as South America in terms of being a continent. I'm going to put it below South America just because it's less commonly regarded as a continent, because otherwise I think it's basically exactly the same in terms of quality. Now we're going to two more culturally defined continents before we get to the weird ones. Next up, we've got East Asia. In terms of culture, I'm going to put it in B tier. I think it would be A tier if it weren't so explicitly culturally defined. The fact that its geography is like way worse than pretty much any other continent we've talked about. I think this is the worst geography score of any continent, like obviously F tier. So because of that, it's just so culturally defined that you have to judge its culture slightly more harshly than you would judge other countries. So it would be A tier otherwise. I think it does have slightly too much cultural variation. Just the fact that like Japan and South Korea are Western, and then you've got North Korea and China, which are Eastern. I realize that's funny because South Korea and Japan are geographically further east, but you know what I mean in terms of culture. Then there's also Taiwan, which is more Western. And its geography is so harsh, you have to judge it a little bit more harshly in terms of culture. So something that would normally just take it down to A tier or might even leave it in S tier, I think is going to bring it down to B tier. Overall, I'm going to put it in D tier. Based on my own personal opinion, I don't think it should be a continent. I think it's better than Central America in terms of being a continent, but I don't think it's as good as any of the C tier ones. Okay, final continent that isn't like a bonus, basically, is South Asia. It's got the same problems as East Asia. I don't know if I want to talk about the exact same talking points again. So B tier for culture, F tier for geography, D tier overall. I'm gonna put it even below East Asia just because there's also religious differences, but it has almost exactly the same problems as East Asia. Okay, last three continents. These are not real continents. These are just bonuses because I figured I should talk about them. I think some people would bring them up in the comments if I didn't. So I think it's worth talking about these. First up, Zealandia. Some people actually think this should be considered a continent, like legitimately think it should be the 8th continent because it's submerged below the sea shelf. I literally cannot hold myself back from laughing. I did like 3 takes there. Like, people actually think that Zealandia should be considered a continent because there's like some land that's higher up in the sea. Okay, culturally, C tier. It's as culturally similar to itself as a country can get. Sure, there's the Maori people, but like F tier in terms of geography, and they're so F tier in terms of geography that I'm not even gonna put them in D tier. For these bonus ones, I'm just gonna put them where I think they should actually go. It's a worse idea for a continent than Asia by a long shot. Like, I feel bad having Asia sit right next to it, even though Asia is F tier, because of how much worse idea of an idea as a continent it is than Asia. I'm sorry, but New Zealand doesn't make sense as a continent. It is 2 islands that just happen to have shallow waters between them. Indonesia has shallow waters. The channel between England and France is quite shallow. Shallow waters doesn't mean a continent. It just means that the waters are shallow. New Zealand, I don't think was ever a continent. Like, at least Antarctica would be a continent if there weren't ice there. But also, I think the ice counts as part of the continent anyway. I've already explained that. I don't think anyone is saying Antarctica shouldn't be considered a continent, which is why it's in S tier and it's alone in S tier. Zealandia is an F tier, and I kind of want to make an F minus tier, but I feel like Asia was getting a bit lonely in F tier. So now it's next to a continent that's so bad it makes Asia look like it is the obvious choice for the most continent-like continent to ever exist. Okay, next up is just all the continents that are created when you define continents tectonically instead of by geography. I was originally going to have these all be separate, but I feel like they all have the same logic behind them, which is geographically S tier, culturally F tier. So overall, it's either B or C tier. I'm going to put it in B tier. I do think it's a decent idea if there weren't plates like the Nazca plate, which, have you ever heard of Nazca? Like, obviously, Nazca shouldn't be a continent. The Pacific plate also exists, but, like, and yes, it's an oceanic plate. I believe the Nazca plate is also. But I feel like there's just a lot of weird plates that don't really make sense to be continents. So if you define all plates tectonically, then you would end up with a lot of weird continents. Also, the fact that I think pretty much the average of this tier list is B tier if you include all the continents that are defined by this. So I think B tier makes sense. I actually am going to put it at the top of B tier, below Eurasia, but above South America, because I do think it's a decent actual way of categorization. It's the only way of categorization that's actually scientific. Okay, finally, and this is mostly a joke one. I don't think anyone actually thinks this is a good idea. What if the world were considered to be one continent? This is basically just extrapolating from the joke of Afro-Euraustralasia, which, I'm sorry, but anyone who actually suggests this is making a joke anyway. So I'm just taking the joke to its logical extreme and saying, why not include the Americas and Antarctica, even though it's not in this image? And actually, I'm going to analyze this as if it were an actual continent, even though this is a joke, because I do think it's better than a lot of the continents on here. For culture, I'm actually going to shockingly put it in B tier. That might be a bit surprising, but I think humans do share a common culture. I think if anyone's trying to consider the world as from the perspective of a continent and from cultural unity, humans do share a lot of things in common. Sure, there's the ISS, which you could consider to not be part of the world if you wanted to have a joke. But until people land on the moon, considering the world to be one continent is really considering humanity to be one culture. And we do have a lot of unifying things about us. It is obviously more culturally varied than you would expect for a continent, but I feel like that's part of the expectation, like people who are defining the world as a continent, which is nobody, but if people were, they would have that in mind. So I actually think it is justifiable culturally. And geographically, I'm going to put it in A tier. Like, I think, again, people who are trying to define the world as a continent know that it's not like a landmass, and I don't think a continent is a landmass, and I think it is genuinely a good way to divide up the world, to not divide up the world into continents. I mean, we've already spent this entire video basically mocking the idea of there being continents because it's kind of a silly idea that doesn't really make sense when you dissect it in the way we have in this video. And so why not just keep the world as one continent? Geographically, it makes sense. It is literally the only one with perfectly clear borders. It has more clear borders than Antarctica because there's a few islands and also the archipelago thing for Antarctica, which is why I put an A tier for geography. This is literally perfect in terms of having well-defined borders, because if it's on Earth, then it's part of this. Come to think of it, it does have the ISS problem. And if humanity ever goes to space, then is that part of the world? I would say not, but okay, maybe it's not perfectly geographically defined. I am going to leave it in the bottom of A tier, though, between A and B tier, because I just think I want to point out that it is genuinely better than all the things listed below it in terms of defining continents. Just to point out that continents are kind of silly. So, based on this video, you might already have anticipated, and you would be correct in assuming that I see the world as having 4 continents, being Antarctica, America, Oceania, and Afro-Eurasia. Hopefully I made it clear. Those are the 4 best continents besides the world, which I do think is better defined than Afro-Eurasia. But you have to define these 3 or 1 continent somehow, so yeah. Make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet to see more fun videos like this. Make sure to smash that like button if you enjoyed the video. And with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.